Roberto, first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to explain these complex concepts to us. And, it really takes a lot of experience in monetary economics, I think, to think through cryptocurrencies and also see where they may be going into the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Do you think that in the future we'll have some sort of crypto asset, I'm not going to call it a cryptocurrency,
not yet,
that can deliver us not just some vague store of value, but really like a medium of exchange, a unit of account, something that people will be able to use on their daily lives?
Well, I do think that for example, Bitcoin today is indeed a store value. I mean, the value is very volatile, but it does store value. The store value property is that you don't have a predictable depreciation. So for example, a banana doesn't have a store value. You just buy the banana and it will deteriorate with time. So anything that is perishable is not a store value. So Bitcoin already has that property. And I think that it is already used as a medium of exchange. So I agree with you. There's a tremendous possibilities that this will become at least those two properties. There is a question about when it will become a unit of account. For a unit of account, what has to happen is that we define a service and that we price the service in that currency. The dominance of the dollar today is very big. So you can have two countries, let's say China and Malaysia, and they are exporting to each other. You could imagine that they could decide that the price of the services is in renminbis or baht or whatever currency. They pick the dollar, and they don't do the transaction in dollar, but they price it in dollars. I think that internationally is going to be hard for that to be broken, but I don't think that you need to get all the way to a unit of account that we determine the price of the services to be useful. I think that it can be very useful by becoming a very good store value and a very good medium of exchange, so that we actually make the payments with that. So I think that the possibilities, yes, are there. I see the future exactly like that.
So you see the dollar as a global reserve currency today. But if we roll back the clock in history and go way back, how did that history of money kind of evolve over time?
Oh, that's a very good question. Actually, if you look at the world at the end of the 19th century, the currencies that were the store value were the pound, the Swiss franc, the German mark. I mean, so those were the currencies that had international presence. What happened is that even though the dollar was gaining relevance, it was the World War II that changed that dramatically. So what shifted the emphasis out of the British pound and the French franc and the Swiss franc, when we switched to the dollar, it was right after World War II, is that we needed now a currency that was strong enough. If you think about the assets of European countries were debilitated, and therefore their currencies were weaker. And so it was 1954 when actually the US became the most, the currency of reference in the world. But we needed this massive event to change the views of the world. Since the 19th century, for many, many years, it was actually other currencies. And the US was the biggest economy. So it was not about size. I mean, the US became the largest economy in the end of the 19th century. So it was not about size. So this is not entirely about size. You need more than that. So they have free market size, but they needed some event like the World War to change the dynamics of that game. So that's why I think it's just going to be here for a little bit.
It sounds like a lot of it is about trust in institutions and in kind of the fundamentals of those institutions to survive changes in all sort of economic climates. Is that correct?
Yes. I think that most of the value of any currency comes from trust, and the trust comes from the way the assets that the central bank already has and how they manage those assets. So with trust, you are willing to hold the asset. Without trust, you are not. I mean, let me give you an example. Again, Venezuelans don't want to hold bolivars. I mean, by the way, not a single person wants to hold bolivars because you don't trust the management, you don't trust the collateral, and therefore, in some sense, that piece of paper has no value.
So how can you build trust with a digital asset? What do you think are the main frictions between cryptocurrency being something interesting, an early stage, and an experiment in society, into becoming something that's really in our daily lives and can really help on a number of dimensions?
That is a very good question. And so I think this depends what are the alternatives. right now, most people think that they have an alternative to a cryptocurrency because they have a checking account and they have a credit card. So when they think about cryptocurrency, they say, well, I have a credit card from American Express. I can use this everywhere. So why should I use Bitcoin? And therefore, people, in order to people to adopt and build the trust, it's very important to understand the alternative. So talking about developed nations, where people, most of them have bank accounts and they have credit cards, I think that the support of the institutions that we already trust is a fundamental aspect of that. So if I'm in Germany, in the United States, in France, in Italy, in the UK, I think that the support of the central bank saying this is an asset that I believe is valuable and their value is stable relative to my currency. You can call it the e-dollar. For example, it's like a cryptocurrency where it's fully backed by US dollars. Those will go a long way to create the trust and the willingness to accept it. By the way, I think they should be called the Rigobonian, just not because it's related to my last name. I think it's way sexier than the e-dollar. Like e-euro sounds like horrible, no? But anyway, that's aside. But the second aspect of that is that when you think about an emerging market, the adoption is much easier because for a lot of people that are in emerging markets, they are not in banks. I would say that between a third and 40% have no interaction with the financial system. So actually, for them, offering a currency that is stable, let's assume it's stable, that assume it's properly designed, the adoption rate should be much bigger because it's an entry to a financial world that will benefit their lives that they don't have access to today. So I think it's important to understand what the alternative is and how people feel about the alternatives. People don't realize how costly it is to use a credit card internationally. So they don't realize the cost, so they don't necessarily understand the benefits. But the trust comes from, I think, one from the support and from the other one on the alternative.
So let's say the Rigobonian is now a thing, and you're running the main central bank, right? The one that it's the global reserve currency on the planet. What do you think are the main challenges in that new regime? What are the things that, as a central banker now, you see those as both opportunities and challenges in this space?
So I will first, the design will be related to that challenge. But if I were, for example, let's say my currency is fully backed by US dollars, my biggest challenge will be liquidity. The day I have, let's say, $10 trillion of transactions, I need to make sure that when people when they want to exchange from the Rigobonian to the, current dollar, when they change from the cryptocurrency to the actual cash, that someone actually provides the cash. So the liquidity and the conversion of that into goods, for example, is a very important part of this statement. So in other words, people can go to a store and pay with the electronic dollar or pay with the dollar. So that is fundamental. And that will be the biggest challenge. Now, if I'm defining a currency that is not attached to a particular currency, so it's not one-to-one, so let's assume that we design a world currency that can be more of a world reserve currency, then the management here is to define what basket is important to stabilize. The management of a currency requires the definition of a basket for inflation purposes. We need to define what basket is appropriate, and then we want the price of that basket or the cost of the basket to be relatively stable through time. That's how we actually manage a central bank. So when I'm doing this worldwide, it will be important to understand what is that basket. That would be a very difficult challenge. And not only that, that basket is likely to change. If we look at the world consumption in the 1960s, China had a very small share of that consumption, but today will be much bigger. So the challenge will be how to adopt that basket, how to make that basket world relevant. Because if I'm going to have a world currency, it better be world relevant. So if we suddenly start all eating more kale and kimchi, well, maybe that basket has to eat more kale and kimchi. So I think that's a very important challenge. It's not clear how we're going to respond to that. And in fact, I don't have a very good answer.
If you'd like to revisit any of the sections, please press the relevant button.